Welcome to the Fantasy Footballers DFS Podcast with your hosts, Kyle Borganoni and Matthew Betz.
Welcome in. It's February, which means it's Super Bowl time here on the Fantasy Footballers DFS Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Borganoni, and I am joined, as always, by Matthew, here we go, Betz.
I always laugh when Kyle does that right before we hit the actual drop to start the podcast because it's great and it makes me laugh every time. It kind of reminds me of all the Mario games I would play when I was a kid. We talked about N64 on the pod before, so it definitely brings back a little nostalgia listening to that. And it's dude, you do a pretty good rendition of it. I'm not gonna lie.
Woo! Yeah! No, I've done this a time or two, just in the car by myself. But I did want to give listeners who have stuck around. You know, we're getting towards the end here of Super Bowl and of DFS pod season, where we take a short little break. We get to come back for the NFL draft. But yeah, every single time we hit record, there's kind of this cadence that we have in the studio of usually Jeremy, our producer, gets to count down with like a movie, overlay voice. Like he's pretty good at that, like a trailer voice, like in a world. Like he's pretty good at that. But then I always say, "Here we go." That wasn't as good right before. So
not your best effort there on that one.
I'll try better. My kids are excited about the new Mario movie that's coming out in April. Chris Pratt, maybe not the best Mario voice, but hey, he's Chris Pratt. We'll be there for that. But you're here because you want to talk Super Bowl. And you're really here because you want to hear us, two dudes, talk about the Super Bowl for 2 straight weeks from a DFS and a betting perspective. So we're going to jam-pack this episode. This episode is going to be more about an overview, talking about our favorite early bets. Next week, we'll talk about even more props that kind of as the lines move. And then kind of showdown strategy. I feel like this is a good time for people who haven't played that in a while. We talk about it. We have some episodes, some evergreen content on the website. But what is the strategy behind playing DFS with just one game in mind, on DraftKings with the captain, on FanDuel, where it's just, do you have the best plays? Because you don't have to deal with price. So, yeah, I think this will be a good episode. And you, my friend, you have some DGen bets in here, I feel like.
Dude, I mean, come on. This is our time to shine. Last year, we hit a bunch of really, really fun ones. The Cooper Kupp MVP one was a huge one for us. Of course, we were on the field goal props for the Bengals kicker McPherson a couple of times throughout the playoffs. That was huge. Opening kickoff to be a touchback was big for us last year. So yeah, there's some fun ones, and it's unreal the sort of action that the books can get on the Super Bowl, because you never see these props for a normal week 14 game or something like that, or even in the conference championships and those games for the playoffs. So there's a lot of fun ones out there. I will just preface the show this week and next week with saying, be smart with your bankroll. It's very fun to be like, I'm firing off 17 bets this week on the Super Bowl. And I probably will do that, let's be real. But it's easy to get stuck in just wanting to have so much action on the game. Still be smart about what you're doing. But we're going to have some fun ones on the show today and some fun ones next week, as well as in the article on the site. And a couple long shot bets, too, that'll be fun to hit. So we'll look at those and get you set to sweat the big game. But, man, for me, this is going to be the ultimate happiness hedge sort of week, because if the Eagles win, it doesn't matter to me what happens. I'm going to be so happy about my bets losing or winning, that if the Eagles win, I'll be good. But you better expect that I'll have maybe some Mahomes MVP tickets or something like that just to hedge my happiness here for this Super Bowl.
Do you have any just straight up Eagles money line?
I actually do have Eagles. I took it when it was -1, and when it kind of like shifted, and that's the first thing we're going to talk about today is the actual line itself and kind of where it moved and started. But the opener Sunday night of this past week was actually Chiefs -2.5, which is what the books told us they think is correct. And I don't know if it was just, me and all my Philly friends just hammering the Eagles, but it moved so quickly to Eagles -2.5, and there was another correction. It said, oh, wait, let's go back towards the Chiefs. Now it's -1.5. And honestly, I don't think that the line really matters that much, meaning if it's less than a field goal, it's sort of, historical data will tell you it doesn't really matter. It's sort of just pick who you think is going to win. But if it gets out to, for whatever reason, +3 on either side, to me, that would be the best bet on the board.
I just got this visual of all these people in Philadelphia just hanging out together, in their Phillies gear. They got their Gritty from the Flyers, their mascot for the Philadelphia Flyers, Philly Fanatic, like all those people just hanging out together, and they're just betting. They're just betting like, hey, let's move this line. And I think really the telling thing will be when sharp money comes in, which usually waits a little bit. They wait for the public who gets really excited about it. Now we're in kind of a weak lull where you're going to get people like us talking about it, but the heavy hitters, the people that actually, have some money to throw things around like bets, are going to be doing that. So we'll talk about that game. If you want to get all of our picks, including our official props for the Super Bowl. Last year, we had a great year in terms of projecting. You can get that in the DFS Pass. It's free, so you still get 2 more weeks to hang out with us in our Discord channel as well, the DFS. So go to dfspass.com if you want to get that for free. But let's talk about this slate.
State of the main slate.
So I've refreshed and refreshed and refreshed. And this is the line we have right now. We're recording on Thursday. And it's Eagles -1.5. The over-under is at 50.5. Any early takes on this? I have an early lean, but we can compare past data for these teams. We compared past data for the Super Bowl. I just want to say early, I like the under. And maybe I'm just an old man.
I actually like it as well.
Oh, man, we didn't even talk about this.
No, we didn't talk about it before. I lean the under as well, which is sort of scary given that the line moved a little bit. It was 49.5 a couple of days ago. It's now at 50.5, like you said. I wouldn't be surprised if that's just kind of the general public. Like, we all love rooting for things to happen. It's very human nature to root for overs instead of unders. So if you actually like the under, I think I would probably wait and see if this comes in at 51 or 51.5. But I do lean the under to you as well. We've been talking about the Chiefs' trends when we do their game previews every week, that they just are not a good team against the spread historically, and their games actually play to the under more often than not. And so I could definitely see a 24-20 sort of game or something like that in this spot. So I agree with you. I think lean under. And just in general, it wouldn't be surprising to see these teams come out and kind of play a little cat and mouse sort of game, like who's going to be aggressive first or who's going to really take a deep shot first. So I kind of lean like a slower start to the game is kind of what I'm seeing. And then it picks up in the second half. So I kind of like under, from the game total. And I think like the first half under is sort of interesting.
Yeah, this has been bet up a bit. It was at 49.5 earlier. It's at 50.5. It could go to 51. Just to give you some context, in the Super Bowl, the under is 28, 26, and 1, so a little skewed towards the under. But then this year, in 50-point games, which is usually the mark we always talk about in DFS, 65% of those games that have had a 50 total have hit the under. That's pretty significant in the betting world. Anything above 50, 55% is a big deal. 65% says that, in general, the public is a little bit more, They like higher scoring, and that's what we like in the Super Bowl. And we would say these are two good offenses. Let me take you back to last year. Bengals and Rams. That total is at 48.5. Okay, two great offenses. It finished at 43. The year before, Tampa Bay, Kansas City. That total was 56.5 bets, and that total finished at 40. So trends are, I would say, that the under is in play here. And that there are paths to failures, but, there's also, these are two great offenses, Patrick Mahomes. So keep that in mind. That's just my early lean, and I'm glad that you kind of feel the same. But hit me with some more Super Bowl betting stats.
Yeah, so looking at, the favorite versus the underdog, it kind of doesn't really matter. It doesn't apply too much in this game because the spread is just 1.5, and I've kind of said it's been on both sides for the Chiefs and the Eagles already since it opened. But favorites are 36 and 20 straight up, and 27, 27, and 2 against the spread, meaning Vegas knows what they're doing when you think about the spread and how they kind of view the favorites here. So, yeah, it's sort of one of those that I kind of, at this point, would stay away from. I don't really see a ton of value on either side. We'll talk about what I would do if you think the Chiefs win. I'll kind of give you some advice of what I would think I would do in that situation in the MVP markets. But, yeah, from the line itself, I think it's pretty efficient. These are just so hard to beat. Like, we have not only years of data that Vegas is working off of, but now so many games in this season for both these teams that this line is going to feel really sharp. And like I said, I could see a 4-point, 3-point sort of game here, a field goal finish. So it seems to be a very close game is what I think is going to happen, and the books think the same thing.
Yeah, and let's go back to just the Chiefs. I think the assumption is that this offense is just putting up 35, 40 points, and they haven't been covering at the rate that we want. So I think people need to recalibrate who the Chiefs are. Like, even in the playoffs against the Jaguars, like, I forgot that game ended pretty close. Like, the Jaguars actually covered. So whatever you think of the Chiefs offense, it's great. It's more methodical than high-powered, I would say. That's a better way to describe what Patrick Mahomes is doing. Let's talk about MVP, and then you and I will get into our early favorite bets and kind of, really start spiraling out of control. Where we, man, I looked a long time at Jake Elliott, and
you and me both, brother.
Dude, what's funny about Jake Elliott is, like, he's been a pretty good kicker in the league for a couple years now, and I don't know if you watched. Well, I know you watched the game, but like when the punt hit the wire in that game, and they were complaining about that. Do you remember that play?
Yes.
Yeah. Jake Elliott just goes out in the field with his backwards hat, big old beard, like, dude, you look like you are just some random fan out on the field. Like, you are not an NFL player.
Like he dressed up as an NFL player for Halloween or something.
Yeah, he probably dressed up as himself. Just like, hey, I'm Jake Elliott, just, backwards hat kicker here.
No big deal.
So we'll talk about those bets. Let's talk about Super Bowl MVP, because that's one of the ones that clearly people talk about the most, they care about the most, and then we'll get into like coin flips and all the fun stuff. With Super Bowl MVP, it's hard to have tons of confidence in saying one of these two quarterbacks isn't going to be it. Like, you can have some good values on the board for Super Bowl bets, but I feel like the list is shorter than people realize.
Yeah, what's funny about I started kind of smiling when Kyle said there's a good value here. Is it just reminds me of some of our long shot off-season ones where it's like, hey, this price is not correct, but I know it's never going to win. And I do feel like there's a couple on the board today that I kind of like from that perspective, which means, they're fun little sprinkle just in the event it happens. But historically, looking at the numbers since 2000, the Super Bowl MVP, 82% of the winners have either been a quarterback or a wide receiver. We saw Cooper Kupp last year. With the quarterback being the heavy favorite, winning it at about a 60% rate. We talk about the MVP market a lot in our offseason shows for the season, and the numbers for the quarterback are much higher. So there is a chance, I think, that someone not named Hurts or Mahomes, can win it. It just seems like when I look at this thing and I think about the Chiefs, I think about the narrative, right? Like, all of his wide receivers are banged up. You've got Kadarius Toney, Juju, and Mecole Hardman all injured. And then you think about him playing through this high ankle sprain. I just feel like if the Chiefs win this game, it's going to be very hard for anyone not named Mahomes to win the award, which is what I was saying. I think there's some value. And actually, just if you think the Chiefs win, I would rather just bet Mahomes for the MVP than take the money line for the Chiefs, because the money line for the Chiefs is plus 105. You can get Patrick Mahomes MVP at plus 130. So if you think the Chiefs win, personally, for me, that's how I would play it.
Is there any... I feel like with a defensive player, you have a better shot at just defensive touchdown, like for the Chiefs, than trying to win the bet for any of these defensive players.
Are you saying, like, you think just in general, like the market where it says who will win, defensive or offensive player, or like quarterback or the field?
Well, I'm just like, if you're trying to pick MVP here and you're saying, you know what, I think Brandon Graham at, plus 8,000, or Hassan Reddick after having a monster game is probably going to gain some steam from some people. Like, I'd rather just pick the Eagles to score a defensive touchdown anytime defensive touchdown than picking one of those players. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and what it's going to take for one of these defensive players to win, you look at back at the historical games, the Super Bowl, of when these guys have won a defensive player. It's been because of not only big plays in big moments, but like a defensive touchdown is scored, multiple interceptions with pick sixes, strip sacks, recovering a fumble, and the games are very low scoring when that happens. It's like, okay, the quarterbacks were fine, but they didn't really do anything, and the game finished 14-13 or something, and those defensive touchdowns meant so much to the game. So if you are going to pick one of these guys, you really need the under to hit. You need Hurts and Mahomes to be meh, and not really do too much. So, it is a tough sell. Like we said, there's some kind of fun long shots, but really I think for me, the best bet that I would make just looking at this right now, again, is if you think the Chiefs win, for me, it's Mahomes at plus 130.
Yeah, running backs are always so tempting because if you see a game script that hits the under, you're like, okay, well, this running back gets 2 touchdowns. That's where the touchdowns flow. And, like last week with Miles Sanders, like he probably would have been, him or Hassan Reddick would have been like the game MVP, if you're thinking about it that way. So that's a route to go. I just have a hard time getting behind Miles Sanders and having any confidence any week because he's all over the map. And then we saw a couple years ago, Damian Williams had a great game for the Chiefs, probably should have won it, and Mahomes ended up. So I'm with you. I think later on I might have some other thoughts of like, okay, what would it take for Dallas Goedert to get there? Because nobody's going to be betting him over Kelsey. What would it take for Juju Smith-Schuster? So we'll go through some more of those scenarios this next week, but I think Betz is right in that regard. Let's get into our early favorite Super Bowl bets.
Well, wait, can I give a fun long shot?
Oh, you're okay. Go for it.
Before we move on to this one, so kind of a galaxy brain sort of take, but again, this is a bet that will lose probably, but I think there is good value on Josh Sweat. The defensive end for the Eagles is 150-1, an absolutely ridiculous line. He is a starting edge player for the Eagles, really involved in their pass rush. This, Hassan Reddick has gotten a lot of the headlines for good reason. He's been incredible. But when I think about Andy Reid being a very good head coach, I kind of picture a lot of chips from Travis Kelce on that side of the line where Hassan Reddick plays, lined up, by the way, over Andrew Wiley, the second most pressures allowed. So, he's going to need help against Hassan Reddick. If they put that much attention on him, could you see Josh Sweat getting 2-3 sacks on Pat Mahomes, who's going to drop back 40, 45 times with still less than 100% ankle? I don't know. It's not the craziest thing in the world. Again, you need the under to hit. You need him to have multiple sacks, probably recover a fumble, hopefully score a touchdown. It's one that stuck out to me like, why is it where it is sort of thing. So that's all I wanted to say.
What you're saying is instead of being, 1,500 plus 1,500, he should be more like where Brandon Graham is, like plus 8,000.
Yeah, exactly.
So can I start off and go down a little rabbit hole about coin toss?
What could go wrong? Go ahead.
Okay. So I don't bet this personally. Like I think it's like fun, and you find out really quickly, like, oh, did I make some money? What that really means is when people bet the coin toss and they get it right, they go, ooh, I have some more money to bet in the game. That's really what they're doing in their app. Yep. So the odds on winning the coin toss is, you just double your money. It's plus 100 right now, either way, because it is literally 50-50, we would say. But what I'm more interested in is that on DK, you can bet who wins the coin toss, so Chiefs or Eagles. And then I've kind of gone through and looked at what every single team does on their first play this year and what their tendencies are, and it's actually pretty drastic. Like, it was way further than I thought. So you can bet on this first play to be a pass at minus 105 or a first play to be a run minus 120. The Eagles this year, and we talked about this last week, right? Like, the Eagles like to establish, things through the air early on. They like to take deep shots. This year, in Jalen Hurts starts, the Eagles have thrown the ball 70% of their first plays. That's pretty significant. While the Chiefs are the exact opposite. In their games, including the playoffs, they have run the ball almost 75% of the time. So what that tells me is that if you want to correlate these two bets, you can't really get a parlay. That'd be a sweet parlay if I can just add all those in that way. But if you want to correlate these on which team wins coin toss, then you can also kind of jump the other way and say, okay, if the Eagles win the coin toss, they're probably going to defer because that's what these teams have done the entire year. They're going to defer
a lot.
Yeah. They're going to defer. And if the Chiefs get the ball, I think they'll run the ball. But so that's just one way that I went down this rabbit hole of like, okay, coin toss, I don't care about. But what these teams do first play, I think is kind of interesting.
So can you still bet this market after the coin toss has happened?
I don't know that.
You'll have like literally a minute to do it. But
yeah,
if this is good research, because if the Chiefs are starting out with the ball, I would bet minus 120 for a run for sure.
Yeah, and you can do live, flash bets and stuff like that. There are some markets that I think you can get out there. It says Chiefs first play or Eagles first offensive play. So you can go through that, but it was fun going through the game logs, including a Jaguars game where the Jaguars said, all right, we'll kick first, but we're going to onside kick. And they got the ball. So anyway, that's my first one that I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, that is actually an interesting point. I'm going to make a note to myself to try to look into that for next week's show and see. And if not, we'll kind of be riding in the dark with you. But if the market still is out there for like literally as the coin toss happens, and you can follow some of the beat reporters for both teams on Twitter. And oftentimes there's a little bit of a delay in the broadcast on your TV. So you might be able to see, Eagles won the toss, they defer right before it shows on your TV. Maybe you put a little wager in on the Chiefs run. So Kyle's in the lab, as they say, early in the week here with these bets. I'm going to hit you with one as well that you'll know whether or not this hits right away. It's one we took last year. I'm back to it. The opening kickoff to be a touchdown. It's a yes or no bet. Yes is minus 165 on BetMGM. This was like minus 190, almost minus 200 on other books. I think there's good value at minus 165 for the yes to happen. I would not take anything worse than this. You just don't want to be laying minus 200 on a prop that is relying on a kicker to kick the ball for a touchback. But like Kyle, I am slightly embarrassed to admit how long it took me to research this yesterday. And let's just say some other tasks that I have that are definitely a lot more important did not get done, so I'm a little behind. But if it works and it hits, it's for the people. So I went back and looked at Jake Elliott and Harrison Butker, their first kick of either the game to open or the first kick out of halftime as kind of their quote unquote, opening kickoffs. These two are a combined 6 and 2 to the yes, kicking for a touchback when the game is being played in a dome. This is notable because they're playing in the Cardinals stadium this season for the Super Bowl. That is a dome-like condition. They have the retractable roof. Is that right, Kyle? It's the retractable roof?
Yes.
Yeah. And, there's not really going to be any weather concerns in Arizona. So I kind of like it. And actually the Eagles too, when they've had opportunities to return a kickoff that's been into the end zone, they've done it just once this year. That came when the kickoff went just 1 yard deep. In other words, if Harrison Butker is putting the ball deep into the end zone, the Eagles are taking a touchback to open the game. So I like this one. Again, I wouldn't take anything worse than 165, minus 165, but on BetMGM, that is a play for me.
It is also, just from a pure emotional standpoint, whatever you're watching the Super Bowl with, Betts will be watching with all Philly people, whatever it is, like whoever the kickoff is, you get to just be so excited for a moment that people are like, okay, now the game starts because after the kickoff. So go for it. Just to get it out of your system. And last year we were heavily on this. It hit. It's a fun way. So we have this one actually in our article if you want to take it there. But let's take a quick break. Let's go through a couple other quick favorite bets, and I will stay with the theme. It's kickers, man. And I don't know why. There's just something in me that says I need to stay in this vein. So the one I like early on in the week is your boy, Jake Elliott, under 7.5 points. Depending on where you can get it at minus 110, it's minus 125 on DraftKings. This gives Jake Elliott an implied odds of 55%, which, hold on, let me make sure. Yep. 55! I mean, that's spot on. But if you go through Jake Elliott's logs and you actually think about this team, this is a good offense. He actually hasn't been very good for fantasy and for kicking purposes. I know none of you guys out there care about kicker fantasy purposes, but this year, Jake Elliott has hit this line in just 6 of his games. 35% of the time, Jake Elliott has hit over 7.5 kicking points. And the Chiefs, just for those at home, are 4th best in schedule-adjusted kicker points since Week 10. So, what I'm trying to say is that if you're projecting this game to go under, which we are, and we're also projecting the fact that Jake Elliott isn't as integral, this team goes for it on 4th down, then under is kind of where I'm leaning with him.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was hoping you'd bring that up in terms of the 4th down, going for it on 4th down for both teams, actually. So I think this is a pretty decent play, especially because, the Eagles, if they get in close and if they're 4th and goal from the 2, this team is not going to kick a field goal unless the game, unless they need the field goal to tie or win, like in the 4th quarter. They're going to run a play with Jalen Hurts or something like that. So Yeah, I think it's a pretty good play, especially when you consider that you can get it at like minus 110 on most books. So that is very interesting. I do like that one quite a bit, and I'm not in the least bit surprised, Kyle, that you spent most of this segment talking about kickers. I am going to talk about more of a fun player to cheer for and root for. That is Travis Kelce, who is very good at the game and scores touchdowns in the postseason. I hate the anytime touchdown markets because they're oftentimes very incorrectly lined, meaning you're having to lay minus 130, minus 140 for an event that we know is there's a lot of randomness to it. However, I found Travis Kelce anytime touchdown minus 116 on Caesars, and it's actually minus 109 for anyone out there that bets on Bet Rivers, hashtag not a sponsor, but it's over at like minus 130, minus 140 on FanDuel, DraftKings, that kind of thing. I would not play that, but if you can get these better odds for Travis Kelce anytime touchdown, the reason I want to play it is not just because he's awesome and he has 9 touchdowns in his last 8 postseason games. It's mostly because I was trying to find a play where we could capitalize early in the week on the Chiefs wide receiver core injuries. We talked about it already. Kadarius Toney, Juju, Mecole Hardman. I think there's a good chance one of those guys might sit, and there's a very good chance all 3 are less than 100%, in a week and a half for this game. That should just lead to even more usage for Travis Kelce. And we've seen these kind of weird plays from Andy Reid when they get inside the 10-yard line. Travis Kelce gets those little like underhand dump offs, they throw on the quick screen, stuff like that. So anytime touchdown for Travis Kelce, minus 116 or better, I do like.
Yeah, and we've kind of hit on this theme with the Eagles. Outside wide receivers usually have issues against them. Darius Slay, James Bradbury, but the slot is kind of, and that's what Kelce is for this team. Like he's their best slot wide receiver, better than Juju, and they use him in a lot of different formations. So I love that. I think there's lots of different things you're going to get to pair this week with Travis Kelce. He's probably going to be one of the more popular players. With the Chiefs, one of the things that I've been looking at is looking at their totals because they haven't been covering and they haven't been hitting the points that I want them to. And so one of the things you can bet is total points bands, meaning you get a range of what you can say, hey, this team's going to score. And right now, the Chiefs to score between 21 and 30 points is at plus 140. You can get it higher on other books. Since week 8, they've averaged 26.9 points, and they've hit this band in 9 of their 12 games. This is kind of the range they keep going in, is between 21 and 30. So there is some value there if you are scared of their team implied total. If you're like, hey, like 24 and a half points, like I could see it going either way. Like this is just another way to bet that if you don't want to do it.
And what's interesting, the first thing that came into my head when you were talking was like, well, if we think the under hits, do we really think they're going to put up 27 points? But, we just talked about it. The Chiefs games have been hitting the under, and they still have been landing in this mark anyway. So that's interesting. Right. I didn't even look at this market, truthfully. So that's one that I'll have to go back and look at. But I do think there's pretty good value if you can get it at plus 140 or better. That's super interesting. Okay, back to the player props. I'm going to hit you with one that this player has been polarizing for everyone all year long. It's Miles Sanders. And what I want to look at with Miles Sanders is the actual rushing yardage. So we have a real player prop for you on the show, finally. I'm going to go over 55.5 rushing yards. I would take this anywhere up to like minus 120, minus 130, or if it moves, like I'd take it at 57.5, 58.5, anything like that. He's been over this line in 12 of 19 games, so he's hitting the over more often than not. But I really wanted to look at, is this recent Kenny Gainwell usage more noise, or is it like a legit thing? Because anyone who is against Miles Sanders in fantasy or DFS has always said, Kenny Gainwell mixes in too much, I'm too scared to play him, things of that nature. Look at the last 2 weeks. What has happened? They played against the Niners without a quarterback. They did not have to do anything in the second half. Why would you run Miles Sanders into the ground in those situations when the game was already over? He's been dealing with this little like knee issue for the last month. Now he has 2 weeks to heal. The week before against the Giants, again, the same thing happened. He was dominating the usage in the first half. They just blew him out, and they didn't need to do anything after the second quarter. So I think this Kenny Gainwell role has kind of been overblown by the general public, that when the chips are down, the game is tight, the game is close, it's going to be Miles Sanders. And I went back to look at in the Eagles games this year that were decided by 10 points or fewer, so relatively a close game. Miles Sanders is averaging 16.3 rushing attempts per game. That should be plenty enough value if he gets somewhere around 15 carries in this game to go over this line. It's PFF's number 1 offensive line. The Eagles were number 1 in rush offense DVOA this year. Kansas City has faced 5 teams who rank in the top half of the league in rush DVOA on the season. Here they are. The Bengals were number 4, Samaje Perine went 21 for 106, 5 yards a carry. The Bills were 11th. Devin Singletary, 17 carries, 85 yards, 5 yards a carry. Josh Jacobs, the Raiders were 8th. 21 carries for 154 yards, 7.3 yards per carry. They played him again. This game did not go as well. He only averaged 2.64 yards per carry. But then the 49ers were 7th. This is the first game CMC was a Niner. He and Jeff Wilson combined for 15 carries, 92 yards, over 6 yards a carry. In other words, you can run on the Chiefs when you are a good running offense. The Eagles are the best run offense in the league. Give me over 55.5 yards for Miles Sanders.
Where would you set this line? If you were, Betts' book, where would you put this at?
Somewhere in the low 60s, like 62.5, 63.5, something like that.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. It's a lower line than that was my first reaction as well. I'm very happy with Miles Sanders. Very happy with him because last week, let's just say I went a little overboard on him, Miles Sanders, and your boy MVS. That gave me a pretty good week.
You had a great week in DFS. I did not play much of Miles Sanders at all, and they crushed him in the run game. So yeah, he was a great play in DFS.
Yeah, one of the stats that I really liked too that, it's anecdotal because it worked for me last week, but was that Miles Sanders, Devonta Smith have major negative correlation in games. So if you're going to play one, don't play the other. And so I had no lineups that had those two together in them. So if I had a Miles Sanders in there, I just said, no, thank you. Don't need Devonta Smith. It was a weird slate last week because it just went under in general. But Miles Sanders is on my good list right now. I like him after scoring 2 touchdowns. I'll give one more. Jerick McKinnon is a weird player every single week to project. He was on that TD run, and the last couple weeks has been cold. I don't love his touchdown bet, but his splits in Chiefs wins are very clear. He scores in Chiefs wins. He doesn't score if they lose. So if you want to bet Jerick McKinnon to score any time, plus the Chiefs to win, it's at plus 360. So you're getting way better odds there than you are just to get Jerick McKinnon to score any time, which scares the life out of me considering his usage. But let's talk about this slate.
Salary standouts.
I'm looking at the salaries in front of me, Betts, and we're going to release those on the podcast, kind of giving our first take on them. And so I just want to get your gut reaction of any players on DraftKings specifically where, we'll talk about in a second, Showdown strategy, how is it different? But anybody at captain that you like early on in the week, and we're going to go through all the strategy. We're going to talk through all of it next week from DFS, but anybody that when you looked at these salaries, you're like, you know what? My early lean is this.
Yeah, when I was looking at everything from a DFS perspective, it's really easy to just look at the guys at the top and say that's where I have to start in this game. For obvious reasons, Jalen Hurts, highest ceiling quarterback arguably this year, and Patrick Mahomes, always has 303 in his bag, and he actually, I think, is pretty good as far as captain for non-rushing quarterbacks. I usually don't like to play the pocket passers, but when you think about how Mahomes is going to win in this game, because the wide receiver room is what it is, he's been spreading the ball out a lot, so he can kind of get there where he is awesome, but his guys aren't necessarily the optimal captain, if that makes sense. But the name that really stuck out to me is, again, kind of more of a value sort of play, and these are spots of uncertainty, which is what I like to attack in DFS, where these one-game slates, there's so much variance, is the running backs. All three of them. Miles Sanders at 11.7, Isaiah Pacheco, 10.8, and Jerick McKinnon at 10.2. And I'm not sure what exposures I'll have to these guys, but when I think about what the field is most likely to do, it's going to be trying to jam in Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, and Travis Kelce at the top, and people will certainly want to play the Eagles guys, the wide receivers. But we just talked about the positive matchup for Miles Sanders. If he does have one of these games where he goes, 16, 17, 18 carries and falls in the end zone twice, that could end up as the optimal captain, especially if we think the under hits. And then as far as the Kansas City side, I kind of already mentioned my early lean on this slate and trying to dig up as much information as possible is to see how are the Chiefs going to operate in this game with the injuries to their pass-catching core against very, very good perimeter cornerbacks. I think it's going to be a lot of Travis Kelce, and I think it's going to be a lot of running back usage. It was really weird that we saw Isaiah Pacheco get so involved last week where he wasn't as involved the week before, and McKinnon's role has been elite in December, but over the last couple of weeks has kind of fallen off. So there's a lot of uncertainty there, and in DFS one-game slates, I want to attack uncertainty, especially if they're going to come with low roster percentage. So the salaries that stuck out to me and the projected roster percentages are those three running backs.
I think the salaries are pretty appropriate across the board. Like I didn't see anyone like, oh, they did a terrible job here. It makes sense that Hurts, Mahomes, and Kelsey are going to be a tier above, but it did stand out to me that if you wanted to go captain with A.J. Brown or Devonta Smith, like you're getting enough savings there at captain that you can actually, look somewhere else and get, you're getting different, and you're obviously going to correlate them with Jalen Hurts, but I think there's value there. On the flex side, like I think the Eagles defense is definitely one that should be in play because of the way that they've committed turnovers. Mahomes is a little but slowed, and because we said we don't really love the wide receiver options. Like I don't like MVS this week. He was my boy this past week. I don't know why he came so low in roster percentage, but I think that there's a lot to say on the Eagles side to say, if this game hits the under, which defensive side do I like more? I like the Eagles more.
Yeah, the reason MVS wasn't rostered last week is because he had literally done nothing for about 6 or 7 weeks in a row. And I'm with you. Like, he's the exact type of player that when I look at, I'm like, do I really want to invest in a guy that we know is just so historically boom bust and has many, many down weeks, that do I want to go back to him after one of his best games of his career? Not really. So, and you talk about the matchup, like matching up with these corners is going to be really tough for him. I could see him really struggling to even separate at all. So yeah, early in the week, he's kind of a guy that I'm looking to fade if the field is on him. But as far as other flex values that I kind of look at, I always like to look for me in the kicker range to see, like, are there players there that the field likes, but they have a very tough projection, meaning, and this all is largely dependent on the Chiefs' health of their wide receivers, but like Sky Moore, let's assume the wide receivers are healthy for the Chiefs. Sky Moore is a tough projection for more than 3 targets for at best case scenario, and they're usually the short 8-out type of stuff. So like if one of the kickers kicks 2 field goals, easily he can outperform Sky Moore for just a couple $100 more. So I kind of like looking in that range and seeing like who might be overvalued as far as that, and like trying to go towards the kicker, because if the under hits, I do think some of these kickers might be in play.
The way down there is also really fun. We get on Showdown, we'll talk about that, but you get really cheap players, in the $200 range. Marcus Kemp is a name that at least you need to familiarize yourself with. He had 22 snaps last week, and Marcus Kemp, I don't think people realize, he's been in the league for a long time, but I remember when he was coming out of Hawaii, he was actually a really fun player in college. I had to chart some of his film back in the day. But 22 snaps, like if you knew that Mecole Hardman was out, or Juju was out, if you knew one of those players was out, then Kemp becomes a really good punt play at $200, and I think he'll gain some steam. Did you see our boy Kendall Blanton's actually on this? He's technically a Chiefs roster.
I was just looking at some of these names. It's wild what they have in the player pool. I forgot Melvin Gordon was technically on the Chiefs, which is hilarious. But yes, I did see him all the way down there. Also notable, Justin Ross is in the player pool. He hasn't played at all this year. But one thing with Marcus Kemp, just real quick on his usage last week, kind of a sneaky injury. Justin Watson was Kyle's MVP. I mean, this guy's incredible, according to Kyle. Was inactive last week due to an illness. And I think there's a very good chance that Marcus Kemp becomes not even in the lineup if Justin Watson is active. So just point that out. Like, don't get too locked in early in the week on Kyle's new MVP of the Chiefs, Marcus Kemp.
I do think there are some tight ends, because these teams do run 2 tight end sets a lot, that will be interesting in tournaments. Noah Gray's $1,200, Blake Bell $400, your boy Jack Stoll. Remember that one week we talked about Jack Stoll?
Yeah, he had like 1 catch for like 12 yards.
Yeah, dude, he almost X'd on his salary. He
Love
almost
that.
paid it back. Jack Stoll $600. Like, those are the plays. And then let's just pour one out here. CEH, you see him on here? $1,000.
Yeah, it's over, man. It's over.
When I was going back through the game logs earlier and I was looking at what each team did on their first plays, like the first month of the season, the first play for the Chiefs was CEH run. That's all they did. It's just,
dude, he was like the RB4 in fantasy over the first like 5 or 6 weeks. It was unreal.
It's weird to even think that he played this year, because
I know
I have no memory of it. All right, let's talk about Showdown strategy. And, we'll talk more about salaries and construction next week, but let's refresh people the strategy of one game, how it works. We talked about this many times. We have articles on the site, but just so people understand, with one game, you are trying to find what is the optimal plays, but you have to weigh out what the opportunity costs are and how other players are playing this. So if I'm putting Jalen Hurts as my captain, okay, this is what I'm saying he has to do, and this is what I would say Mahomes captains can't do, if you're thinking more from tournament. So you're thinking of opportunity cost, and then you're also thinking how the rest of the field is going to do that. You and I usually talk about roster percentages, and we'll have those out for this slate, roster percentages for both captain and flex. You could also think about combinations. Like, okay, if I have this player and we haven't projected for 65, percent rostered, I need to think of who's another player that also I can combine with this that maybe correlates really well and what their roster percentages are. So we're playing a game here. It's only one game we're looking at. So random things can happen. And I think people don't realize that like your lineup is going to be duplicated so many times because everyone else, there's a small pool of players, but random things are going to happen.
For sure. And, just speaking to that kind of overall thought process, like when you have 13 game main slate or 12 game main slate on Sundays, we are really able to kind of look for the best plays. On this, you need to almost kind of like remove your football guy cap a little bit and just embrace that there is going to be randomness in this game. If we see one of those weird, trick plays and they throw it to like the backup, like Kyle was saying, the backup tight end for one of these teams, and he catches a touchdown and it's a 1-yard touchdown catch, that player is going to be optimal because he's so cheap. So you just need to embrace, I think, some of the randomness that's going into this game. Doesn't mean you just like throw everything out the window and just, close your eyes and just hit optimize in a lineup generator. But I do think there's some value in looking at what the field is going to do and then just asking yourself, how likely do I think that is to happen? Because some of my best weeks in Showdown over the last few years has just been trying to get leverage on the field. Even if I agree with the field, like even if I think Jalen Hurts is an incredible MVP play or a captain play if you're on DraftKings, like there are paths to him failing, right? So just kind of think about that. And that's why we kind of always say embrace the GPP mentality. I'm not going to play cash on this. We almost never do. And I would also say, this is a good one to run a 20 max if you are into 150s. You do want to embrace the variance. So I'm going to be doing that as well. And then last thing before we kind of move on to the Showdown captain strategy specifically, in terms of what you should spend on these slates, there is a very, very strong correlation in terms of being duplicated, meaning your lineup matches someone else's when you spend more money. So it's almost a 1-to-1. When you spend more money, the more likely it is that your lineup is going to be the exact same as someone else's. And it's not that that's necessarily the worst thing in the world. It's just that when you think about these payout structures on DraftKings, they're so top heavy, and we are trying to win first, second, third, fourth, fifth place. That's where the money is. You kind of have to get up there if you really want a big payday. And so if you're splitting that with 10, 20, 30 people, is it really as much of a payday as you think? Probably not. So I think there's some value in leaving money on the table on these slates, even if you don't think it's the best move, quote unquote, from a football guy standpoint. The data tells us you're going to get duplicated if you spend up.
Yeah. And if you have a popular captain, that's okay. It doesn't mean that like, okay, I don't want to get duplicated. I need to have Marcus Kemp as my captain or, Blake Bell. You should get Justin Ross. Definitely go for Justin Ross. Nobody. Actually, you know what? I want to see that. I'm going to dare somebody to light their money on fire by putting Justin Ross as their captain. And maybe in a free one.
I'll tell you what, it will not be duplicated. I'll tell you that.
There you go. If you have a popular captain, just get unique elsewhere. You can get unique in your combinations. It's totally fine. You can play Mahomes. You can play Hurts. Like, we're not going to say don't do it. But yeah, your $50,000 budget, if you come in, let's say $1,000 below, like you're thinking like, oh, I'm doing great. Like on this small of a slate, it's still going to get duplicated a lot, just not as much as, it goes way up once you get close to that 50,000 mark. So get weird, have fun. It's a good one. And the last thing I'll say is we're correlating our lineup. You're going with a game script, you're running with it, and you're saying, here's how I think this is going to go. And just know that random things are going to happen. It doesn't mean if the game hits the under, only the running backs are in play. Like, you could have a Devonta Smith touchdown, a Travis Kelce touchdown, and you're like, oh, I thought the under hit. And no, just think of the game flow, think of how things are going to go. But let's talk about captains. On DraftKings, we're dealing with 1.5 times the price and 1.5 times the output. So we actually get more points here. That's why we care about it. Why should we mostly be thinking about captains from a winning team? Like if I could say one thing, like project who's going to win.
Yeah, historically, a lot of the optimal captains, when you look at these big tournaments, come from the winning team. And it doesn't really take a lot of thought process to understand why. It's because touchdowns matter a ton in this format, obviously in every format of fantasy, but specifically in this game, if your guy is not piling up yards and catches and touchdowns, he's not going to end up as the captain. And so when you think about hitting a ceiling performance, it's through touchdowns, and that means your team is scoring more than the other team. That's your hot take of the day. So yes, historically, the Showdown captain optimally comes from the winning team. So I'll be correlating as such, meaning if I think the Eagles take care of business here and they win by a touchdown, I'm probably not going to play Patrick Mahomes captain, for example.
Yeah, and it's kind of shocking that the field doesn't do this as much as you think. Like the field actually is just taking it and saying, here's the good player, but you are actually in the top 1% of lineups. We looked at the data over the last 3 years, 75% of top 1% lineups were using the one who is actually winning the game in the captain spot. So that's what you really want. And the field in general is probably a little too confident in quarterbacks. And so that's why we preach all the time, wide receivers in the flex. And then in this case, wide receivers that we're actually using a captain spot always kind of allow you to outdistance the field because it's full PPR. So that's why earlier I was talking about A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith. Like I think they're better than what their price suggests they should be. But let's just quickly go position by position. What do we need from a quarterback if they're going to be our optimal captain?
Yeah, so we talked about the favored team, obviously kind of being the leading decider here. This one is tricky because the spread is so tight that it doesn't matter as much. But historically, again, from the winning team, the captain, quarterback, if it's going to be a quarterback, it's from the favored team from the Vegas spread. But the thing that I look at is just if I am going to roster one of these guys, whether it's Jalen Hurts or Patrick Mahomes, make sure you're stacking. And the obvious reason is because for Patrick Mahomes, especially with that ankle, if he is going to be the optimal captain, let's say he throws for 275 and he throws 3 or 4 touchdowns, you need his pass catchers to also come with you to win the tournament. So I'm going to be stacking these guys for sure. Minimum of 1 for both guys. I honestly think for Patrick Mahomes, I would do a minimum of 2. And I think a little contrarian way to play, just kind of early thinking about this, people get very uncomfortable when they start to see too many of one team in their lineup, that because we know Mahomes spreads the ball out a lot, like you can stack him with 3 guys even, maybe even 4 if you want to get crazy. And then for Jalen Hurts, historically, his best games have come from him rushing. And I think that's obviously still an outcome that's likely to happen. But let's say that the Chiefs happen to get up by 2 scores and they have to throw a ton in the second half. If he is, ending up as the optimal captain via just passing, you could have some positive leverage on the field with stacking him with more than just one guy, which I think a lot of the field is going to do. So make sure you're stacking with your quarterback if you are going to be there at captain, and thinking about kind of what that does for the rest of your roster construction.
Yeah, on FanDuel, Jalen Hurts is actually cheaper than Mahomes, $500 cheaper. And because you're not dealing with the same salary thing, like I think he's an even better play there because of the rushing upside, because the bonuses don't come in play. So I think Hurts is, we're giving context for mostly for DraftKings, but on FanDuel, I think Hurts is an even better play there. You mentioned earlier Miles Sanders could be a sneaky captain play, like if they get 2 touchdowns. I think the running backs as a whole, they're best used as leverage on quarterback wide receiver stacks, which I think will be clearly very popular in this game. But let's mostly talk about wide receivers here and why they matter, because they have the widest range of outcomes possible. Like you could get last week MVS with 26 plus DraftKings points. And then this week, like it would not shock me if MVS had 3 this week.
3 total points?
Yes. Like one catch.
Yep.
Yeah. And so that's what you're playing off of. And if the field is overconfident, and we kind of have to see based on our roster percentages, like the field is overconfident in MVS, then I will come in underweight, and vice versa. I like to basically look at the wide receivers and see, okay, who are the plays that they're saying, oh, this is going to be a MVS game, or this is going to be a Juju game. I think this is going to be a game in the slot that the Chiefs can attack. They're just going to do it in a lot of different ways, right? Like Mecole Hardman, if he was active, I would actually think he's a pretty interesting play. Same with Kadarius Toney, because they can man that part of the field. But in Showdown, you get wide receiver ones. They average less points because quarterbacks score the most, yet the roster percentage in captain is so different. Like that's why we care so much, is people aren't rostering wide receivers enough in the captain spot. And I think you probably have at least 3 to 4 options on the slate that I can legitimately see. Like, obviously the 2 Eagles guys. And then if I knew Juju was fully healthy, I could say he's potentially there.
Yeah, I mean, and like you said, this is kind of one of those spots to attack when the field is off a certain player because of recency bias. But there was a stretch early this year, remember, where Juju was seeing like 8 targets a week. So, yeah, we need to see what happens with the injuries there. But Kyle's main point is just when these wide receivers have these kind of outlier games, there's so much leverage on the field if you have that guy that it can pay off in a huge way. You will lose frequently if you just do this every week in and week out, but this is one game, anything can happen. So when you win a lot is kind of the point. I will also throw into the mix too, like I think both tight ends kind of qualify. Right. Historically, tight end captain is not great when you're looking at the Austin Hoopers of the world and guys like that. But we have Travis Kelce, who is a wide receiver, and Dallas Goedert, who is very athletic and can create these huge plays. So I'll also be including them in my pool of wide receivers or pass catchers to target for outlier games. But historically, tight ends aren't awesome.
Is there some like deep-seated pain that you just pulled out of thin air? You're just like, you know what? I'm going to dunk on Austin Hooper here.
I don't know why, but that's just the first thing that came to my mind. Like, he's not that great.
There's no way this guy could break a slate.
No, yeah, not a chance.
He's no Jack Doyle. I'll tell you that.
No, baby hands.
And then I'm not going to really go through it, but like kickers are not going to be optimal unless it's a game that totally hits the under. They're almost never the right captain. And in defense, in this type of game environment, you need at least 1 score from the defense, and we would just say that's not something you want to project. In general, like we looked at the playoffs, and the defensive scores almost didn't even matter because they're putting up, 5-6 points. So we'll talk more. I like the Eagles, my early lean. If you want to get them as a flex option, I think it's good. Let's just talk about overall construction. I think what people end up doing when we only have 6 spots to work with is they want a little bit from one side and like, okay, well, I think the Eagles will keep it close, or I think the Chiefs will keep it close. And so we see a lot of lineups that have 3 Chiefs and 3 Eagles, and explain to the people why that is doo-doo.
Yeah, and this is so tricky too, because this is a conversation about what happens most often versus how much leverage you gain when it doesn't work. And the 3-3 construction feels right. It feels safe. Like you said, you got 3 from each side. It's balanced. It looks good. It looks clean. You hit submit and you're like, all right, let's roll. But the issue with that is that is what the field is going to do. And historically, over the last 3 years, that is the highest roster construction across every season that I've done research for. People love 3-3. And sometimes that is optimal. So I'm not saying it's a bad play, especially if you're playing 150 lineups or 20. Like, you should have some of that. But there is a lot of leverage if you go 4-2, meaning usually what we kind of talk about, like 4-2 or 5-1. The first number is the favored team. So, for example, 4 Eagles, 2 Chiefs, or vice versa, run it with 2-4, with 2 Eagles and 4 Chiefs. So that to me is one that I'm going to be kind of looking at to see how the field wants to play this. But we can almost confidently say, without even looking at the numbers for this week coming up, that 3-3 is going to be the most popular. So just know that. And if you are going to play it, I would be considering some unique captain choices in those builds.
Yeah, and you can look at, we talk a lot about correlation on here. I mentioned Devonta Smith and Miles Sanders last week. Like, okay, if I'm building a lineup and I think the Eagles are going to win, I think Miles Sanders is a great play. I think Devonta Smith is a great play. I will probably set rules to say, hey, those 2 might not be in the same lineup. It doesn't mean they can't be in the optimal, but if I'm doing 20 max, I'm doing 150, I'm going to set rules to say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to put this together. Same thing with Travis Kelce, who's, I don't know, he could be the most popular play on the slate, like aside from the quarterbacks. Like he's just going to be the dude. Him and Jerick McKinnon have pretty negative correlation. When it starts to get close to 0.4 or negative 0.4, I take notice and looking at their correlation coefficient. So Kelce and McKinnon don't have great. Kelce and the defense don't have great. Kelce and Butker, though, do have pretty strong correlation. So consider that. Obviously, Kelce and Mahomes will too. It's more about, for me, when I'm constructing my lineup, I'm running with a game script, and I'm being willing to go with the other guy. So the average captain roster percentage for a wide receiver 1 is almost 9%. So, A.J. Brown, 9%. Wide receiver 2 usually has half of that. So I think it'll be even more interesting when you start looking at the Chiefs, like nobody knows who the Chiefs wide receiver 1 is. But I think based on practice reports, based on, later on in the week, it will be clear, Juju Smith-Schuster says, I'm a full go, or Justin Watson says, I was sick, puking my guts out last week, but not this week. Like, because he's a baller. Dude is a straight up baller running routes.
What's going to be hilarious, and I can't wait for this to happen, is he's going to run like 6 routes and catch 2 touchdowns. And you're going to be texting me the whole time. I told you, man.
Dude, I'm going to definitely you know what? I don't like lighting money on fire. No one does. But a Justin Watson anytime touchdown bet in the Super Bowl?
Now we're talking.
Book it. Book it. Just for fun. Just because he's a superstar. I'm all about that. So we'll talk more next week into the nitty gritty of the salaries. Hopefully you have a good overview. We'll get to post this on the website as well, that you get to kind of begin to think and percolate on the Super Bowl. You can talk about it in our Discord channel. You can do all that. And if you want to play with us, you can go to ballersdfs.com. You can play in our DraftKings League, Borg plus Betz. We have a lot of fun things, including a contest last week that I placed 4th.
Did you get paid?
I did. Oh, yeah. It was top 5 pay.
I thought it was going to be like a top 3, and you were like, I got 4th. And then you didn't want to include that you didn't win any money.
No, I was sitting in first for a while. Like I said, it was a pretty good week for me, mostly because I was overweight on MVS and overweight on Miles Sanders, and I mostly faded the Niners. So it was a good week for me.
Yeah, it went perfectly for you then.
I know. The game script-wise, you and I were pretty clear about those games. I feel like in the playoffs, we've been good on the lines.
Yeah, and the over-unders as well, which means everything that we said about this, you can throw it out the window.
We used our Super Bowl juju last year, our good juju with T. Higgins and the boys. But yes, we can't wait. It'll be Super Bowl. It'll be fun. And Andy, Mike, and Jason will be at the game. So once again, it'll be a good week. Betz, sign us off.
Yes, sir. Part 1 of our Super Bowl preview. The game is so big, we need 2 episodes to break it down. So hopefully you enjoyed this. We'll be back next week to really give you our final DFS takes for the Showdown slate, as well as more of our best bets for the game. Until then, have a great week. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Fantasy Footballers DFS Podcast. Don't forget to visit us on the web at www.thefantasyfootballers.com.